Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The autumn air in Dodge City carried a peculiar scent in 1880. Not just the usual dust and livestock that characterized this bustling frontier town, but something sweeter, the promise of celebration, mingled with something else that no one could quite place. The first annual Harvest Fair had been announced with considerable fanfare. Posters adorned every storefront along Front Street, their edges curling in the dry Kansas wind. The railroad had brought in visitors from as far as Wichita and Topeka, eager to witness what was being touted as the cultural awakening of the West. Against the backdrop of cattle drives and the fading legacy of lawlessness that had defined Dodge City's earlier years, the fair represented progress, civilization. A statement that Dodge was more than just a waypoint for cowboys and cattle. But within this narrative of progress and community celebration lay something darker, something that would only be uncovered decades later through scattered documents, testimonies, and the unearthing of a weathered leather-bound ledger from beneath the floorboards of what was once the Prairie Rose Saloon. This is the story of the Blackwood sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth, who arrived in Dodge City in the early summer of 1880. Just as the town was preparing for its first harvest celebration. Their arrival was noted briefly in the Dodge City Times. Two sisters of good breeding and Eastern education have established themselves at the newly renovated Prairie Rose, where they will be serving refreshments during the forthcoming Harvest Fair. What the newspaper failed to mention was where the sisters had come from or why two educated women would choose to serve drinks in a frontier town saloon. The omission would later prove significant. According to county records, the sisters presented themselves as widows, though neither wore a wedding band. Margaret, the elder at 32, carried herself with a rigid posture that townsfolk described as uncomfortably proper. Elizabeth, 4 years younger, was noted for her musical laugh and the way she would sometimes stare vacantly out windows, as if seeing something no one else could. They rented rooms above the saloon and kept to themselves when not working. The arrival of the Blackwood sisters coincided with a period of transition for Dodge City. The wild days of the cattle boom were beginning to wane. Law enforcement, under the direction of Sheriff Charlie Bassett, had tamed the once notorious town to some degree. The railroad had brought commerce and respectability. Churches had been established, along with schools and more permanent businesses. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization, Dodge retained its frontier character, a place where the past was seldom questioned, and newcomers could reinvent themselves without scrutiny. The sisters arrived on the afternoon train from the east, recalled Jeremiah Foster, the station agent, in an account given to the Ford County Historical Society in 1922. They had more luggage than most ladies traveling west, 6 matching trunks of fine quality leather. It took 2 porters to manage it all. What struck me as odd was how carefully they watched those trunks, not like women concerned about their dresses and hats, but like guards watching a prisoner. Foster's observation might have been colored by later knowledge of the sisters' activities, but contemporary accounts support the impression that the Blackwood sisters were unusually protective of their possessions. The owner of the boarding house where they initially stayed before moving to rooms above the Prairie Rose noted in her diary that the sisters kept their room locked at all times and refused to allow the maid to clean unless one of them was present. The Prairie Rose had previously been known as one of the rowdier establishments in town, frequented by drovers and gamblers. Under the new management of Augustus Thornton, a businessman from St. Louis, it had undergone renovation to appeal to a higher class of patron. The hiring of the Blackwood sisters was part of this transformation. They brought an air of refinement, recalled Samuel Drake, in a 1926 interview preserved in the Ford County Historical Society archives. Drake had been a regular at the Prairie Rose. The way they moved, the way they spoke, they didn't belong in a place like Dodge, but that made them interesting. Men would order twice as many drinks just to hear Miss Elizabeth recite poetry or to catch a rare smile from Miss Margaret. Elizabeth was known for her ability to recite lengthy passages of Shakespeare, Tennyson, and Poe from memory. Her rendition of The Raven became something of a local attraction, performed every Friday night to a packed house. Margaret, though less overtly charming, possessed a keen mind for business that impressed even the most successful merchants in town. Miss Margaret could calculate complex figures in her head faster than most men could with pencil and paper, noted Thomas Miller in a letter to his brother in Chicago, dated August 1880. I watched her settle accounts with a whiskey distributor who tried to overcharge by $7.43 on a large order. She spotted the error immediately and corrected him with such precision that he left looking quite embarrassed. A remarkable woman. What Drake didn't mention in his 1926 interview, but would later confess to his grandson in a letter written in 1932, was that several patrons who had become particularly enamored with the sisters had disappeared that autumn. "We didn't think much of it at the time," Drake wrote. "Men came and went in Dodge. That was the nature of a cow town, but looking back there was a pattern that we should have noticed. They were all men of means. They all showed particular attention to the sisters, and they all vanished shortly after the fair began." The weeks leading up to the Harvest Fair saw the Blackwood sisters establishing themselves as fixtures in Dodge City society, albeit unconventional ones. They attended Sunday services at the Methodist Church, though they never participated in ladies' auxiliary meetings or other social gatherings. They made regular purchases at the general store, the pharmacy, and the butcher shop. Their shopping habits, later scrutinized by investigators, revealed some peculiarities. "They bought chemicals that most ladies wouldn't know the names of," said Howard Jenkins, the pharmacist, in testimony given to the county sheriff in November 1881, after the truth had begun to emerge. "Carbolic acid, formaldehyde, silver nitrate. I assumed they were doing photographic work." Miss Elizabeth mentioned an interest in the new art of photography, and these chemicals are used in that process. They also purchased laudanum in quantities that seemed excessive for personal use. When I questioned this, Miss Margaret explained they suffered from severe headaches and insomnia due to the noise from the saloon below their rooms. At the butcher shop, they ordered unusual cuts of meat, organs and glands that most customers avoided. Maxwell Butcher, his actual surname, coincidentally matching his profession, later recalled that they expressed particular interest in the preservation of meats. Miss Margaret asked detailed questions about my smoking and curing processes, Butcher stated in a deposition given in 1882. She wanted to know about the effects of different woods, different salts. She took notes in a small book she kept in her pocket. I thought perhaps they were planning to open a restaurant, though they never said as much. The Harvest Fair opened on September 15, 1880, a Thursday. The weather, according to meteorological records kept by the railroad station, was unseasonably warm. The fairgrounds had been established on the eastern edge of town, where several acres of farmland had been transformed with tents, platforms, and makeshift stalls. Farmers displayed their harvests, corn, wheat, and vegetables, that had somehow flourished in the harsh Kansas soil. Craftsmen exhibited furniture, leatherwork, and ironmongery. There were competitions for the best pies, strongest livestock, and most accurate marksmanship. And in a large tent near the center of it all was the refreshment area, dominated by the temporary extension of the Prairie Rose Saloon, where the Blackwood sisters presided over barrels of beer and bottles of whiskey. They wore matching dresses, Dorothy Miller recorded in her journal in 1881. Miller was the wife of a local merchant. Burgundy-colored, high-necked, with their hair pinned up identically, they moved in sync like dancers in a theater production. There was something mesmerizing about watching them work. Sometimes I caught my husband watching them too intently, and I'd have to nudge him to remind him of my presence. The first day of the fair drew over 2,000 visitors, according to gate receipts preserved in the town archives. The atmosphere was festive, with a brass band from Wichita providing music throughout the day. Competitions were held for the best corn crop, the finest quilt, the most flavorful preserves. Children ran between stalls, sampling candies and watching demonstrations of new farming equipment. As evening fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the grounds. The refreshment tent became the center of activity, with the Blackwood sisters as its main attraction. They had hired additional help for the fair, 3 young men to assist with serving and cleaning, but they personally handled all interaction with what Elizabeth referred to as their preferred clientele. They had a system, explained Jacob Stern, one of the hired servers, in an interview given decades later to a researcher from the Kansas Historical Society. They'd watch as men entered the tent. They'd exchange a glance, just a quick look, and then one of them would approach certain customers. Not the cowboys or farmers, but the well-dressed ones, the ones with money. They'd serve these men personally, chatting with them, laughing at their jokes. The men ate it up, being singled out by these exotic, educated women. What Miller's journal entry doesn't reveal is that her husband, Thomas, would become one of the sisters' most devoted patrons, and would later be counted among the missing. The first few days of the fair proceeded without incident. The attendance exceeded expectations, with visitors praising the organization and the quality of exhibitions. The Prairie Roses tent was particularly popular, not just for the alcohol it served, but for the mysterious sisters who poured it. Men would line up to be served by them rather than by the male bartenders who also worked there. It was on the 4th night of the fair, September 18th, that the first disappearance occurred. Harold Whitaker, a cattle buyer from Wichita, had been seen throughout the day at the fair making deals and inspecting stock. Witnesses later reported that he spent the evening at the Prairie Rose tent, engaged in conversation with Elizabeth Blackwood. He was last observed leaving with her after her shift ended, supposedly to escort her back to her lodgings. Whitaker never returned to his hotel room. His horse remained in the stable and his belongings in his room. When questioned the following day, Elizabeth claimed that she had thanked him for the escort, but had gone to her room alone. No one could prove otherwise, and in the bustling atmosphere of the fair, the matter was not pursued with any vigor. The general assumption was that Whitaker had either moved on to another town or had met with foul play in one of Dodge's less reputable areas. The reality, as would later be pieced together from the sisters' ledger and other evidence, was far more sinister. According to a partial confession found among Elizabeth's personal papers, discovered in 1922 in a bank vault in Denver, Whitaker had indeed escorted her back to her room above the Prairie Rose. "He accepted my invitation for a nightcap with flattering eagerness," the confession read. "I had prepared the laudanum mixture in advance, as we had discussed. 10 drops in his whiskey was sufficient." When his speech began to slur and his eyelids to droop, Margaret entered from the adjoining room. She administered the chloroform while I held his arms. He struggled briefly, but the combined effects of the alcohol, laudanum, and chloroform rendered him insensate within moments. What followed was described in clinical detail: the transportation of the unconscious Whitaker to the cellar via a back staircase, the methodical removal of all valuables from his person, the precise method of his execution, a single cut to the carotid artery, and the subsequent treatment of his remains. Margaret continues to refine her preservation techniques, Elizabeth wrote. The specimens from Subject 7 maintain their color and texture remarkably well after 3 weeks in the solution. Father would be pleased with our progress. The confession, if authentic, suggests that Whitaker was not the sisters' first victim, but their 7th. Who the previous 6 might have been and where those murders occurred remains unknown. 3 days later, on September 21st, another man vanished. Richard Montgomery, a businessman from Topeka who had come to the fair to investigate investment opportunities in Dodge City, was last seen at the Prairie Rose tent. According to several witnesses, he had been particularly attentive to Margaret Blackwood. even presenting her with a small silver brooch, which she was seen wearing the following day. Montgomery's disappearance caused somewhat more concern than Whitaker's had. As a prominent businessman, his absence was noted quickly. A cursory search was organized, but yielded nothing. Margaret, when questioned, stated that she had indeed received a gift from Montgomery, but that he had left the tent alone and quite intoxicated. Again, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, no further action was taken. The Prairie Rose's account books, later recovered by investigators, showed an unusual entry on September 22nd. Special reserves depleted by 2. Replacements ordered. The entry was in Margaret's handwriting, identified by her distinctive sharp-angled script. Alongside it was a notation for the purchase of additional chemicals from Jenkins' pharmacy. By the end of the week-long fair, 3 more men had vanished. Thomas Miller, the merchant whose wife had noted his interest in the sisters, James Harrington, a land speculator from Colorado, and William Shea, the son of a wealthy Chicago family who had come west seeking adventure. All had been observed spending significant time at the Prairie Rose tent. All had demonstrated particular interest in one or both of the Blackwood sisters. The disappearances finally prompted a more thorough investigation, led by Deputy Marshal Frank Jordan. Jordan interviewed dozens of witnesses, including the sisters themselves. He searched the men's rooms, the fairgrounds, and several miles of surrounding prairie. He found nothing conclusive. The sisters were cool as winter frost when questioned, Jordan wrote in his report, preserved in county archives. They answered directly and without hesitation. They expressed appropriate concern. They offered to assist in any way possible. I could find no reason to suspect them beyond the circumstantial evidence of the men's attention to them. And that is hardly a crime. What Jordan did not include in his official report, but later confided to his journal, was his personal impression of the sisters during the interviews. "There is something in Miss Margaret's eyes that disturbs me," he wrote on October 3, 1880. "A coldness, a calculation. She watches me as a hawk watches a field mouse. Miss Elizabeth is different. She smiles and flutters her hands when she speaks, all feminine charm and delicacy. But I've noticed how her eyes constantly seek her sister's face, as if checking for approval. They are like actresses in a play, performing roles they have rehearsed extensively. What I cannot determine is whether this performance is due to the natural caution of women alone in a frontier town or something more sinister." Jordan's suspicions, while strong enough to record privately, were not sufficient to justify any official action against the sisters. Without bodies, without witnesses to any crime, there was simply no case to pursue. The fair concluded on September 22nd. The tents were dismantled, the exhibits packed away, visitors returned to their homes. The Prairie Rose Saloon continued its operation, with the Blackwood sisters as its main attraction. The disappearances became a topic of gossip, then faded from immediate concern. Life in Dodge City continued. Cattle drives came and went. The railroad brought new faces and took others away. The winter of 1880-1881 was harsh, with blizzards that isolated the town for weeks at a time. During these months, the Prairie Rose Saloon became a haven for those seeking warmth, companionship, and the particular charm of the Blackwood sisters. What happened in those winter months was not recorded in any official document. But according to the oral history provided by Sarah Thompson, whose grandmother worked as a laundress at the saloon, the sisters' behavior began to change. "My grandmother said they started keeping odd hours," Thompson told a local historian in 1957. "They'd be seen leaving the saloon in the middle of the night, even during snowstorms. They began to dress differently, too, wearing men's boots beneath their dresses and heavy coats that seemed too large for them. Sometimes they'd return with their hems caked in mud, even when the ground was frozen, and they started taking delivery of large amounts of chemicals, the kind used for tanning hides or preserving specimens. The laundress also reported that the sisters' linens often bore strange stains, not the expected wine or food marks, but discolorations that resisted normal washing methods. She described them as yellowish-brown, sometimes with a greenish tinge. When she inquired about them, Margaret explained that they were experimenting with natural dyes extracted from prairie plants. The explanation was accepted without question. More troubling were the sounds reported by patrons who stayed late at the saloon. On at least 3 occasions, customers claimed to have heard muffled thumping coming from the cellar, as if something or someone were trying to escape confinement. When these concerns were brought to the sisters' attention, they attributed the noises to rats, a common problem in frontier buildings. The cellar itself became off-limits to everyone except the sisters and Augustus Thornton, the owner. Even the barkeep was instructed to inform Margaret or Elizabeth when supplies ran low rather than retrieving items himself. They claimed it was for inventory control, recalled William Porter, who worked as barkeeper at the Prairie Rose from November 1880 to March 1881. Said they didn't want any bottles going missing, but there was more to it than that. Sometimes I'd be working late after most customers had gone, and I'd hear them down there. Not just walking around, but talking in low voices, sometimes laughing in a way that made my skin crawl. Once I heard what sounded like glass breaking, followed by cursing, not ladylike at all. When Miss Margaret came up a few minutes later, her sleeve was wet, and the liquid smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Sharp, chemical, burned my nose just from the scent of it. By spring of 1881, rumors were circulating about the Blackwood sisters. Nothing specific, nothing that could be traced to a particular source, but a general sense of unease had developed around them. Their popularity at the saloon began to wane. Men who had once competed for their attention now found reasons to drink elsewhere. It was in April of 1881 that Augustus Thornton, the owner of the Prairie Rose, discovered something disturbing in the cellar of his establishment. According to a private letter he sent to his brother in St. Louis, which was only discovered among family papers in 1938. He had gone to the cellar to assess damage after spring flooding. I found a section of the dirt floor that seemed recently disturbed, Thornton wrote. Thinking it might be the source of the flooding, I began to dig. What I found has shaken me to my core. A man's pocket watch, partially tarnished but still recognizable as the one belonging to Thomas Miller. And beside it, something worse, a human finger bone with a ring still attached. I replaced everything as I found it and have not returned to the cellar since. I do not know what to do. The sisters are watching me closely now, as if they know what I've discovered. The letter continued with Thornton's observations about the sisters' behavior following his discovery. He noted that Margaret had begun to engage him in discussions about his future plans, suggesting that perhaps the rigors of frontier business were too demanding for a man of his refinement. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had suddenly become solicitous of his health, preparing special teas which she claimed would strengthen his constitution against the harsh Kansas climate. "I find I cannot bring myself to drink these concoctions," Thornton wrote. "I pour them into the spittoon when she isn't looking. I have begun to take my meals at the hotel, claiming that the walk aids my digestion. In truth, I dare not eat or drink anything they offer. Last night I discovered Elizabeth in my office, examining my correspondence. When questioned, she claimed to be looking for a misplaced invoice. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Thornton never went to the authorities with his discovery. According to business records, he sold the Prairie Rose in May 1881 to the Blackwood sisters themselves, who had apparently accumulated significant funds during their employment there. He left Dodge City immediately after the sale and returned to St. Louis. In a curious postscript to this aspect of the case, Thornton's death was reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on June 17, 1881, barely a month after his return. The cause was listed as apoplexy, a term then used for what would now be called a stroke. He was found in his bed by his housekeeper, who reported that his features were contorted in an expression of terror. There was no investigation into his death, which was assumed to be natural given his age, 57, and the medical knowledge of the time. Years later, when the Blackwood case became infamous, Some speculated that Thornton had been poisoned by the sisters before he left Dodge City with a substance designed to cause delayed symptoms. This theory has never been proven, but the timing of his death remains suspicious. The sisters continued to operate the saloon through the summer of 1881. Attendance dwindled, but they seemed unconcerned. They hired new staff and began to make significant renovations to the building, particularly to the cellar, which was closed off to all but themselves. They had men come in from out of town to do the work, said Henry Colson, a carpenter who had initially bid on the job but was rejected. Didn't use local labor, which was unusual. Those they hired worked only at night, and they were gone within a week. The materials they brought in were odd too, not just the usual lumber and nails, but glass tubing, metal tanks, special ventilation equipment, more like what you'd see in a factory or laboratory than a saloon. According to invoice records later discovered in a trunk in the sisters' abandoned rooms, they had ordered this specialized equipment from a scientific supply company in Chicago. The invoice described the items as suitable for a medical research facility or university laboratory. The cost was substantial, over $1,200, a significant sum in 1881. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the Blackwood sisters disappeared. On the morning of August 17, 1881, the Prairie Rose didn't open its doors. When concerned neighbors eventually forced entry, they found the building empty of occupants. The sisters' personal belongings were gone. The only items left behind were business records and a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the bar. The town initially assumed the sisters had simply moved on, as people often did in frontier communities. It wasn't until weeks later, when the new owner, a businessman from Denver who had purchased the property site unseen, began renovations, that the truth began to emerge. Workers removing the wooden floor of the cellar discovered a series of shallow graves. In them were the remains of at least 7 individuals, all male. Forensic methods in 1881 were primitive, but the local doctor was able to determine that the victims had likely been drugged before having their throats cut. Several had been dismembered after death. Dr. Alonzo Wells, who performed the examinations of the remains, wrote in his report, "The precision of the incisions suggests someone with anatomical knowledge. These are not the crude cuts of a butcher or a frenzied killer, but the deliberate work of someone familiar with human anatomy." More disturbing still is evidence of post-mortem experimentation. Certain organs have been removed with surgical care. Others show signs of having been preserved in chemical solutions before being returned to the body cavity. Among the identified remains were those of the 5 men who had vanished during the harvest fair. The other 2 bodies were never conclusively identified, though one was speculated to be that of a cattle broker who had passed through Dodge in late autumn of 1880. The discovery caused a sensation. The Dodge City Times ran the headline, "House of Horrors discovered beneath Prairie Rose, Blackwood sisters suspected in multiple murders." A manhunt was organized, but the sisters had vanished completely. No trace of them could be found on any passenger list, stagecoach manifest, or railroad record. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The investigation that followed pieced together fragments of the sisters' activities. According to the ledger found beneath the floorboards of what had been their private quarters, they had been methodically targeting wealthy men, drugging them, and then murdering them for their valuables. The ledger contained detailed accounts of their victims' possessions and their estimated worth. But there were entries in the ledger that suggested something beyond mere robbery. Notations about specimens and preservation techniques, references to the continuation of Father's work, and advancing the understanding of human cessation. These cryptic entries have never been fully explained. The cellar of the Prairie Rose had been converted into what could only be described as a primitive laboratory. Glass containers lined shelves along one wall, many still containing preserved human tissue. A large table dominated the center of the space, its surface stained dark brown. Drainage channels had been cut into the wood, leading to collection vessels. A cabinet contained surgical instruments of high quality, neatly arranged, and meticulously maintained. Most disturbing of all were the notebooks found hidden within a false wall of the cellar. These contained detailed observations of the victims' deaths, heart rate as it slowed, pupillary response, muscle contractions, even attempts to record final utterances. The notes were written in a precise scientific hand, with occasional margin comments in a different script, suggesting that both sisters participated in the documentation process. What is known, based on banking records discovered in 1907, is that the Blackwood sisters had made significant deposits in banks across Kansas, Colorado, and Missouri throughout their time in Dodge City. They had accumulated wealth far beyond what could be explained by their saloon work or even by the stolen valuables of their victims. One theory, proposed by criminologist James Harrington in a 1938 paper on the case, was that the sisters were selling anatomical specimens to medical schools or private collectors. During this period, the demand for cadavers and preserved specimens for medical education far outstripped legal supply. Schools and researchers often turned to grave robbers or other illicit sources. The Blackwood sisters, with their apparent medical knowledge and lack of squeamishness, would have been well positioned to profit from this market. Consider the economic logic, Harrington wrote. A pocket watch or wallet might yield $20 to $50 in immediate gain. But a well-preserved human heart, brain, or other organ could command prices 10 times higher from the right buyer. If the sisters had established connections with medical institutions, perhaps through their father, they would have had a lucrative market for their grisly merchandise. This theory is supported by shipping records from the Dodge City Freight Office, which show that the sisters regularly sent crates to addresses in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The contents were always declared as preserved biological specimens or scientific materials, with duties paid accordingly. No one questioned these shipments, as it was assumed they were sending preserved animal specimens collected from the Kansas prairie for naturalists or museums. The last verified sighting of the Blackwood sisters was by a station master in Kansas City, who recalled 2 women matching their description boarding an eastbound train in late August 1881. According to his statement given years later, they were dressed like high society ladies, not saloon workers. They had a lot of luggage, matching leather trunks with brass fittings. They kept to themselves and boarded quickly when the train arrived. I remember thinking they seemed anxious to leave, though they tried to hide it beneath their composed exteriors. After that, the historical record goes silent on Margaret and Elizabeth Blackwood. Numerous theories emerged about their fate. Some believed they had returned to wherever they had originally come from, possibly the East Coast, where they might have resumed their murderous activities under different names. Others suggested they had fled to Europe or even South America. In 1902, a woman named Eleanor Wilcox was arrested in Baltimore for poisoning her husband. Contemporary newspaper accounts noted a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Elizabeth Blackwood, and there were calls for further investigation into her background. However, before any conclusive links could be established, Wilcox died in custody, apparently by her own hand. The method of Wilcox's suicide was unusual and sophisticated. A small glass vial concealed in her hair, containing what was later determined to be a rare and fast-acting poison derived from certain tropical plants. The investigating officer noted in his report that Wilcox had the demeanor of an educated person, despite her claims of being a simple housewife. Her knowledge of chemistry, evidenced by the nature of her husband's poisoning and her own suicide method, suggests training far beyond what would be available to most women of her station. In 1917, the diary of a Philadelphia doctor, Jerome Blackwood, was discovered among his effects after his death. The diary, dating from the 1860s, described experimental procedures he had conducted on unclaimed bodies from the morgue. Procedures focused on the preservation of human tissue and the study of death. The diary also mentioned his 2 daughters, whom he was educating in the medical arts despite society's narrow views on female education. The daughters were named Margaret and Elizabeth. This discovery led to speculation that the Blackwood sisters had been continuing their father's questionable medical research, using their victims not just for financial gain, but for scientific experimentation. This theory would explain the chemical purchases noted by the laundress and the cryptic entries in their ledger. Dr. Blackwood's diary revealed a man obsessed with understanding the precise moment of death, what he called the transition from being to non-being. He wrote extensively about his efforts to document this transition in terminal patients, sometimes in ways that suggested he may have hastened death in order to observe it more closely. Today's subject exhibited the most remarkable pupillary response yet recorded, read one entry from February 1864. As consciousness faded, the eyes remained fixed on my face, as if attempting to memorize it for some post-vital recollection. The girls assisted admirably, Margaret timing the various physiological cessations, while Elizabeth recorded my observations verbatim. They are becoming quite proficient, though Elizabeth still shows an unfortunate tendency toward emotional response when the subjects make sounds. The diary made no explicit mention of murder, but certain passages suggested that Blackwood's ethical boundaries were, at best, fluid. He repeatedly referred to securing specimens and arranging transitions in contexts that implied more than simply waiting for natural deaths to occur in a hospital setting. The Prairie Rose Saloon was demolished in 1883, the site considered tainted by the horrors discovered there. For decades, the land remained vacant, with locals refusing to build on it despite its prime location on Front Street. In 1924, during Dodge City's restoration project aimed at capitalizing on its Wild West history for tourism, a memorial plaque was proposed for the victims of the Blackwood sisters. The proposal was rejected by the city council, who felt that drawing attention to such a grim chapter of the town's history would deter visitors. The most intriguing development in the case came in 1957, when a researcher at the Kansas Historical Society discovered a series of letters in the archives of a New York medical college. The letters, dating from 1882 to 1889, were from a Dr. M. Blackwell to several prominent medical researchers of the period. They discussed innovative techniques for tissue preservation and contained detailed observations on the process of death that seemed to be based on first-hand observation. The letters were written on paper with a watermark from a mill in Kansas City. The researcher attempted to trace Dr. Blackwell, but found no record of a medical license issued to anyone of that name during the period. However, he did discover that a substantial donation had been made to the medical college in 1890 by a Margaret B. Wilson, with the stipulation that it be used for research into the mechanics of mortality. Was this Margaret Blackwood, using a variant of her name? The evidence is circumstantial at best, but there are other tantalizing connections. The medical college's records showed that Wilson made occasional visits to the institution between 1890 and 1905, always accompanied by a woman identified in visitor logs as E.B. Wilson, presumably her sister. Descriptions from faculty members who met them noted that they were women of refinement and unusual education for their sex, and that the younger sister had a melodious voice that she employed in reciting poetry during social gatherings. The Wilson sisters claimed to be private researchers who had inherited their father's scientific interests and fortune. They never disclosed the nature of their independent studies, but they asked probing questions about the college's cadaver procurement practices and preservation methods. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in 1963, when construction workers breaking ground for a new building in Boston uncovered a sealed vault beneath what had once been a private residence. Inside were hundreds of glass jars containing preserved human specimens, organs, tissue samples, even entire limbs. Also found was a collection of journals documenting experiments conducted over a period of 40 years. The journals were signed simply M and E. The house had been owned by sisters Martha and Emily Wilson from 1883 until their deaths in 1927. According to local records, the Wilson sisters had been reclusive but respected members of Boston society, known for their contributions to medical charities and their extensive travel abroad. They had never married and had left their considerable estate to various scientific institutions. The police report filed after the discovery noted, "The specimens appeared to be the result of systematic collection over many decades. The preservation is remarkable, some dating back to the 1880s, yet maintaining structural integrity due to an unusual chemical solution, analysis pending." The accompanying journals detail what can only be described as a private, unauthorized research program into human mortality. The methodical nature of the documentation suggests trained scientific minds at work, despite the clearly illegal and unethical procurement of human subjects. The journals themselves contained entries that bore striking similarities to the notes found in the cellar of the Prairie Rose. The same clinical detachment, the same focus on the precise moment of death, the same documentation of physiological responses. Many entries referred to subjects by number rather than name, but occasional slips revealed more. A reference to the cattle broker from Missouri, the land speculator who fancied himself a poet, descriptions that matched some of the Dodge City victims. No photographs of the Wilson sisters have ever been found, and their graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery contain only stone markers with their initials, M.W. and E.W. Were these the Blackwood sisters, having transformed themselves once again? The timing matches. The initials could be seen as a subtle nod to their true identities. The interest in medical research aligns with the theory about their father's influence and their activities in Dodge City. A caretaker at Mount Auburn, interviewed in 1964, recalled the Wilson sisters' funeral, which he had attended as a young man. "Strange affair," he said. "No mourners except paid staff from their household. The caskets were sealed, which wasn't common practice then, and there was something odd about the timing. The younger sister died in January, the elder in March, just 6 weeks apart. But here's what always struck me as peculiar. Their plots had been prepared years in advance. Not just purchased, mind you, but physically prepared with some kind of special lining to the graves. I remember my father, who was head groundskeeper then, commenting that it was the sort of preparation you'd expect for someone who feared water seepage or disturbance, almost as if they were burying something they wanted to make sure stayed buried." This testimony added yet another layer of mystery to the case. Were the Wilson sisters indeed the Blackwoods? And if so, did they actually die in 1927, or was this another elaborate deception? The graves were never exhumed, as no legal justification could be established nearly 40 years after the deaths. Further investigation into the Wilson sisters revealed that they had maintained an extensive network of correspondence with medical researchers across America and Europe. They published occasional papers in obscure scientific journals, always as M.E. Wilson, blending their initials in a way that made it unclear whether the author was one person or two. These papers focused on tissue preservation and cellular degradation after death, subjects that would have been unusual for women researchers of that era, but not entirely unprecedented. Their Boston home had been designed with several unusual features, according to architectural plans discovered in city records. The basement level included a room designated as a private laboratory with specialized ventilation, water supply, and drainage systems. There was also a dumbwaiter large enough to transport substantial loads between the rear entrance at ground level and this basement laboratory. Most telling, perhaps, was a collection of newspaper clippings found in a hidden compartment of a writing desk that had belonged to the Wilson sisters. These clippings, yellowed with age, chronicled the Blackwood case and the subsequent manhunt. Some passages were underlined, particularly those describing inaccuracies in the investigation or speculating about the sisters' fate. In the margin of one article, a handwritten note read simply, "Fools." But without definitive proof, the true fate of the Blackwood sisters remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. Their brief but terrifying presence in Dodge City during that fateful harvest season of 1880 left a mark on the town that time has never fully erased. Local legend holds that on cool autumn nights, when the wind carries the scent of harvest from the surrounding farmlands, the faint sound of women's laughter can sometimes be heard on Front Street, near where the Prairie Rose once stood. It's said that men who hear this laughter feel an inexplicable urge to follow it, though no one is ever seen. Perhaps it's just the wind in the eaves, or the collective imagination of a town that has never forgotten its darkest chapter. Or perhaps in some way, the Blackwood sisters never truly left Dodge City at all. What is certain is that the first annual Harvest Fair of 1880 was also the last. No such celebration was ever held in Dodge City again. The very mention of a harvest fair was enough to draw uncomfortable glances and change the subject of conversation for decades afterward. The legend of the Blackwood sisters has inspired numerous fictional accounts over the years. Novels, plays, even a silent film produced in 1922, now lost with only promotional materials surviving in film archives. These works typically embellish the already macabre details, adding supernatural elements that have no basis in the historical record. The sisters have been portrayed as everything from vampires to practitioners of dark magic, their cellar a place of occult rituals rather than grim scientific inquiry. The truth, as documented in the fragmented evidence that survives, is perhaps more disturbing than any fictionalized account. It suggests two women of exceptional intelligence and education who chose to use these gifts in the pursuit of knowledge through murder. Their victims were not random, but selected specifically for their wealth, providing financial gain, and their social position, ensuring their disappearance would be noticed and investigated, creating a more complete record of the aftermath of their crimes. They were scientists of a sort, wrote criminologist Harrington in his 1938 analysis, albeit ones who operated outside all ethical boundaries. Their methodology was sound. They kept careful records. They documented their observations. They refined their techniques based on results. That they applied this scientific rigor to serial murder makes them no less systematic in their approach. In a terrible way, they were pioneers, female killers who murdered not from passion or desperation, but from intellectual curiosity. This assessment is supported by entries in the Wilson journals found in Boston. One passage, dated 1887, reads, "The academic establishment continues to exclude women from meaningful participation in medical research, particularly in those areas deemed unsuitable for the delicate female sensibility. Yet who but a woman could observe the cessation of life with true objectivity? We are accused of being too emotional, yet it is male researchers who flinch from the necessary steps to advance knowledge. E and I have never suffered from such limitations. Father taught us well, sentiment is the enemy of discovery." In 1968, the last known document relating to the case was discovered in a trunk in the attic of what had been Frank Jordan's house. It was a personal journal in which the former deputy marshal had recorded his private thoughts about the investigation. The final entry, dated December 3, 1881, reads, "I dream of them sometimes, the Blackwood women. In my dreams, they're standing behind a bar that stretches endlessly in both directions, serving drinks that glow with an unnatural light. They smile at me with teeth that seem too sharp, too white. Behind them are shelves lined not with bottles, but with jars containing things I cannot bear to describe, even in this private record. They beckon to me, inviting me to drink, to join the others who vanished that autumn. I wake sweating, throat parched, with the certainty that someday I will accept their invitation. Perhaps all men do in the end." Jordan died in 1903 of natural causes. His descendants claim that he never again entered a saloon after the Blackwood case, and that he refused to speak of it even to his closest confidants. His widow, in a letter to her sister, found in family papers donated to the Kansas Historical Society in 1950, wrote that Jordan would sometimes wake in the night screaming about the sisters and the jars in the cellar. She also noted that he refused to allow any scientific or medical journals in the house, even when their son expressed interest in studying medicine. The Dodge City Times coverage of the case ended abruptly in December 1881 with an editorial stating that Continual dwelling on these horrific events serves no purpose but to tarnish our town's reputation and retard its progress toward civilization. This decision was allegedly made after several prominent businessmen threatened to withdraw their advertising if the paper continued to report on the Blackwood murders. The silence that fell over the case in its immediate aftermath may have contributed to the sisters' successful escape and reinvention. By the time outside newspapers and law enforcement became fully aware of the scope of the crimes, the trail had grown cold. Descriptions were circulated nationally, but they were vague and inconsistent, based on the varied recollections of Dodge City residents. In 1885, a woman resembling Margaret Blackwood was reported teaching at a girls' school in New Orleans. When investigators arrived, she had already resigned her position and disappeared. In 1890, a physician in Denver claimed to have treated a patient matching Elizabeth's description for a minor injury. By the time authorities followed up, the woman had checked out of her hotel and vanished. These near misses continued for years, but never resulted in an arrest or a confirmed sighting. If the Blackwood sisters did indeed become the Wilson sisters of Boston, they managed the transition with remarkable thoroughness, creating a completely new identity that withstood scrutiny for over 4 decades. The empty lot where the Prairie Rose once stood eventually became the site of a hardware store in the 1950s. The owner, unaware of or unconcerned with the location's history, operated there successfully for many years. But after his death in 1965, his widow revealed to the local historical society that her husband had often complained of strange noises from the basement, sounds like glass containers clinking together, though they stored no such items there. He would go down to investigate and find nothing, she reported, but the air would be cold, and there would be a smell he described as medical, like a doctor's office. He had the floor replaced twice, thinking there might be some old chemicals leaking from the ground beneath. It never helped. In his last years, he refused to go into the basement at all and hired a local boy to retrieve stock from down there when needed. The hardware store closed in 1967, and the building remained vacant until 1972, when it was purchased by a restaurant chain specializing in frontier-themed dining establishments. During renovations, workers reported similar phenomena: unexplained cold spots, the sound of glass clinking, and occasionally what seemed to be whispered conversations between 2 women. The restaurant opened despite these occurrences, but closed within a year due to poor business. People just felt uncomfortable there, the manager told the Dodge City Globe in a 1973 interview. They couldn't explain why, but they wouldn't linger over their meals. They'd eat quickly and leave. We had more one-time customers than any other location in our chain. They simply wouldn't come back. The building was finally demolished in 1975, and the lot has remained empty since then, used occasionally for parking during town events, but never developed. Local real estate agents report that the property, despite its prime location, generates little interest from potential buyers. There's always some reason they back out, said Marion Lewis, a realtor who has listed the property multiple times over the decades. They find a better location, or their financing falls through, or they suddenly decide Dodge isn't the right market for their business. I've had sales reach the contract stage 7 times, and every single one has collapsed before closing. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood sisters' story is not what we know, but what remains unknown. Did they kill others before coming to Dodge City? Did they continue their activities elsewhere after fleeing? Were they motivated by greed, by some twisted scientific purpose, or by something else entirely? One entry, dated 1893, makes an oblique reference to our Kansas experiment as being informative but methodologically flawed. The writer notes that public settings create too many variables and witnesses, and that future work requires greater isolation and control. This suggests that if the Wilsons were indeed the Blackwoods, they may have continued their murderous research, but in a more private, controlled setting, perhaps explaining why no similar pattern of disappearances was ever linked to them after Dodge City. A partial answer may lie in the Wilson journals found in Boston. The Wilson sisters' Boston home was located in an isolated area on the outskirts of the city, with extensive grounds surrounded by a high wall. According to property records, they employed only a small staff who lived off-premises, a housekeeper who came 3 times weekly, a groundskeeper who worked only during daylight hours, and a cook who prepared meals in advance but did not serve them. This arrangement would have provided ample privacy for whatever activities they wished to conduct. City death records show that between 1883 and 1927, 17 unidentified male bodies were discovered within a 5-mile radius of the Wilson home. All were described as well-dressed and appearing to be of some means, but with no identification on their persons. Cause of death was listed as unknown or natural causes in most cases, though 3 were noted as having unusual incisions of a possibly surgical nature. Were these more victims of the sisters? It's impossible to know with certainty, but the pattern is suggestive. The Wilson journals contain entries that could be interpreted as documentation of these deaths, though they are written in a cryptic style using numerical codes for names and dates. One entry, partially decoded by a cryptographer who examined the journals in 1964, appears to describe an experiment involving controlled exsanguination, followed by arterial injection of preservation solution while subject is still viable. The implications are horrifying, that the sisters may have been experimenting with preserving human tissue while their victims were still alive, albeit sedated. The cryptographer refused to continue his work after this discovery, stating that there are some things mankind is not meant to know. These questions may never be answered. The trail has grown too cold. The witnesses long since passed away. All that remains are fragments of evidence, pieces of a puzzle that can never be completely assembled. But somewhere, perhaps in some forgotten archive or sealed attic trunk, there may yet be another piece waiting to be discovered. Another clue to the true nature and fate of Margaret and Elizabeth Blackwood, the sisters who served more than beer at Dodge City's first and final harvest fair. The case has continued to fascinate criminologists, historians, and the public for nearly 150 years. It represents one of the earliest documented instances of female serial killers working in partnership, and certainly the most educated and methodical female killers of the 19th century. Their crimes combined elements that would later become recognized patterns in serial murder, victim selection, ritualistic elements, trophy-taking, and detailed documentation. Yet they defy easy categorization. They were not sexually motivated killers. They did not appear to derive pleasure from the suffering of their victims. Indeed, they seemed to prefer quick, clinical deaths. Their meticulous record-keeping suggests a detachment more common to scientific researchers than criminals. In many ways, they were ahead of their time, women operating independently in a male-dominated society, using their intelligence to manipulate social expectations and stereotypes to their advantage. They weaponized their femininity, wrote Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a criminal psychologist who studied the case extensively in the 1980s. They understood that as women, particularly attractive, educated women in a frontier setting, they would be both objects of desire and underestimated as potential threats. They exploited the former to identify and isolate victims, and the latter to avoid suspicion. It was a strategy that proved remarkably effective. In the decades since the Blackwood sisters vanished, their methodology has been studied by law enforcement as an example of how killers can operate in plain sight. Their technique of using drugged drinks to subdue victims has become recognized as a common approach in certain types of homicide. Their ability to maintain a respectable public facade while conducting gruesome activities in secret has become a recognized pattern in cases of seemingly ordinary killers who shock their communities when discovered. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwood sisters is the shadow they cast over Dodge City's history. A town known for its gunfighters and lawmen, Its cattle drives and saloons also harbored two of the most methodical and enigmatic killers in American history. They left their mark not in bullet holes or boot prints, but in the persistent silence that fell over the town when their crimes were discovered. A silence that, in some ways, continues to this day. Local school children grow up hearing whispered versions of the story, though it rarely appears in official town histories or tourist brochures. The vacant lot where the Prairie Rose once stood is passed by countless visitors who never know its significance. Yet the story persists, passed from generation to generation, a dark counterpoint to the romanticized tales of the Wild West that have made Dodge City famous. And perhaps in some Boston cemetery, beneath markers bearing only initials, the Blackwood sisters lie in specially prepared graves, their secrets buried with them but not forgotten. The final chapter in their story may yet remain to be written,